This is a brief introduction to the Gallipoli Campaign. In an attempt to break the stalemate that had developed on the Western Front, Winston Churchill, who was Britain's first Lord of the Admiralty, who was in charge of the Royal Navy, argued for an attack on Turkey. Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire and an ally of Germany. The Gallipoli Campaign, as it became known, was the first major battle of World War I for Australian troops. It took place on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. The plan was to force Germany to supply more troops against Russia. Then, France and Great Britain would move troops and equipment to Russia, and then destroy the Turkish army. Although many Australian men who enlisted in the early months of the war believed they would be travelling to Europe to fight against the Germans, many were instead sent to fight against the Turks. The formation of the ANZACS. When the war began in 1914, there was an enthusiastic response from people in Australia and New Zealand. Initially, the two military forces of Australia and New Zealand were separate. The Australian troops formed the 1st Australian Imperial Force, and the New Zealanders formed the 1st New Zealand Expeditionary Force. Early in 1915, as the two forces were training in Egypt, General Birdwood, commander of the Australian and New Zealand forces, decided to combine both forces to form a single corps, and the title Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZAC, was adopted. It was under this banner that the soldiers of both countries fought at Gallipoli and throughout World War I. The Gallipoli Landing. The Gallipoli Campaign was launched because Britain and France needed to move troops, equipment, and weapons to Allied troops in Russia. In order to do this, they needed to travel across the Mediterranean Sea, pass through Turkish waters, and cross over the Black Sea into Russia. As a result, the plan required Turkey, which was part of the Ottoman Empire and an ally of Germany, to be forced out of the war. The first part of the campaign plan was launched in March 1915. This involved a naval attack through the Dardanelles, a sea passage from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. This action failed because the entrance to the Dardanelles had been laid with underwater mines, and these mines destroyed 3 Allied battleships and another 3 were badly damaged. A plan was then developed to launch a land attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula from the Aegean Sea coast. The hope was that the Allies would surprise the Turks, defeat them quickly, and then march on to take control of the Turkish capital, Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul. This would open up the desired supply lines through to Russia and help the Allies to fight Germany and Austria from the east. On the 25th of April 1915, ground troops from Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, India, and the British Dominion of Newfoundland, which is now part of Canada, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The campaign was in trouble from the beginning. As the Australian and New Zealand troops landed at what is now called Anzac Cove, they faced cliffs up to 100 meters high and heavy gunfire from behind the Turkish fortifications. Those soldiers who made it to the beach were unprotected as they faced the Turkish guns. The ANZACs managed to secure the beach and made limited progress up the cliffs and inland. Although the plan had been to take 7 kilometers of territory, the day ended with barely a single kilometer achieved. More than 600 Australian soldiers were killed on the first day of the campaign. They had landed at the wrong place and were ambushed. This was one of the reasons Australia pulled away from the British Empire. Britain knew there was a mistake, but Winston Churchill was too proud to say so. On hearing news of this disastrous landing, the British commander of the campaign, General Sir Ian Hamilton, ordered the troops to dig until you are safe. Hamilton's decision to persist with the campaign was supported by news of the success of the Australian submarine AE2. On the 25th of April 1915, which was the same day as the landing, the AE2 became the first Allied warship to penetrate the Dardanelles. It attacked a Turkish gunboat but was eventually discovered on the 30th of April and destroyed. In May 1915, the Turks launched a great counter-offensive to take back territory taken by the Allies, but were driven back. In August 1915, the Australians and New Zealanders launched 2 famous diversionary attacks, the Battle of Lone Pine and the Battle of the Neck. The Australians captured Lone Pine in fighting so fierce that 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded to their men. At the Neck, a charge by Australian troops cost the lives of 234 in an area about the size of 3 tennis courts. Despite these battles, the situation on Gallipoli remained largely unchanged for the 8 months of the campaign. Over this time, respect grew between the Turkish soldiers and the ANZAC troops on the battlefield. Each side saw the other as honourable, and agreements were made to hold fire and bury the dead respectfully. Both sides had an amnesty, which is an agreement, to enable a number of dead Turkish soldiers to be buried under the Red Crescent flag of their nation. Over time, the two sides even began trading with each other. Conditions at Gallipoli. Conditions at Gallipoli were extremely difficult for the ANZACS. As the Turks held the high ground, the ANZACS were always exposed to enemy fire. Nowhere was safe. They were in constant danger day and night, from snipers or artillery bombardment from the Turkish guns. The Allies landed in the Turkish spring, and a sweltering summer followed. When winter arrived, the bitter cold and snow took its toll on the troops. For men used to the mild weather conditions in Australia, the icy north wind and snowfalls cut right through protection offered by their uniforms and light blankets. Frequent rainfalls flooded the trenches and turned the battlefields to mud. Despite the rain and snow, drinking water was in short supply. It had to be shipped in to the troops, and this could be difficult if a supply ship ran into problems. Water was rationed carefully, and soldiers were so conscious of the shortages that they often shaved with leftover cold tea. Food was more plentiful, although lacking in variety. Rations commonly included canned meat, corned beef called bully beef, and hard biscuits. Fresh food was rarely available. Poor health was a major problem. More Australians and New Zealanders died or were forced into hospital as a result of disease rather than enemy action. Painful conditions and diseases such as trench foot, dysentery, diarrhea, and gastroenteritis were common in the damp conditions of the trenches. Rats, lice, flies, and mosquitoes also spread illness. Many pests were attracted by the strong odor of decomposing bodies and human waste. Poor sanitation and food handling practices meant the germs were often transferred to food and water supplies. Withdrawal. In December 1915, the ANZACS were finally ordered to withdraw from Gallipoli. To hide the fact that they were leaving, they rigged up some rifles to fire at random. They did this by attaching tins to the rifles' trigger mechanisms with string. When the tins filled with water dripping from other tins suspended above, their weight caused the triggers to be pulled and the rifles to fire. This tactic became known as the ghost guns of Gallipoli. Soldiers also carefully wrapped the horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound of their leaving. The last Australian soldiers were evacuated overnight on the 19th and 20th of December. Because of its efficiency, the silent withdrawal is usually remembered as the most successful part of the Gallipoli Campaign. Over the course of the campaign, 8,709 Australians died, and 19,000 were wounded. Over the same period, over 80,000 Turks were killed. During their time on Gallipoli, the Diggers, as Australian troops became known, displayed a courage that would form the basis of the ANZAC legend. This legend would contribute to the Australian sense of identity over the course of the 20th century. Significance. The significance of the Gallipoli Campaign and the origin of the ANZAC legend that surrounds it can largely be linked to the fact that it was the first time that Australia had fought in a war as a nation. Australia had only existed for 13 years as a united country at the time it went to war. Australians at home waited eagerly for accounts of the first encounter of the Australian Imperial Force. When news of the first battles at Gallipoli appeared in Australian papers on the 8th of May 1915, the fact that the landing had been a failure was almost completely overlooked. Commentators at the time, and in the years since 1915, have developed the theme that Gallipoli was a defining national experience. It has been said that Australia became a nation on the shores of Gallipoli. Historians have referred to the Gallipoli experience as Australia's baptism of blood, or baptism of fire. Australian historian Bill Gamage wrote of the experience. The circumstances of a national army, an arena, a brave enemy, led three nations, Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey, to create national traditions from the Gallipoli Campaign. Hope you learned something today, and thank you for watching this video. See ya!